I knew the second Spencer Montgomery leaned back in that overpriced ergonomic chair, lips curling like he'd just won some corporate chess match, that this was going to be one of those days people talk about for years. The guy had that entitled MBA swagger that screams Ivy League from a mile away. 32 years old, Wharton graduate, and daddy got him the job through connections. My name's Adrian Pierce. I'm 48. And I've been keeping Datacore Industries' digital infrastructure running for 22 years. Started here when we were still using mainframes and dial-up modems. Survived Y2K, the dot-com crash, and more digital transformations than I care to count. Badge, laptop, and dignity on my desk. Now, Spencer said with that condescending smile he'd perfected during his McKinsey days. No preamble, no explanation, just a public execution in front of HR and two junior analysts who looked like they'd walked into a crime scene. He even paused after dignity, like he expected someone to laugh. I didn't give him the satisfaction of arguing. I took my badge off, set it next to the laptop I'd already powered down, and placed my coffee mug beside them, like I was staging some office clearance display. Then I turned and walked out. Out in the parking lot, I sat in my car, hands on the wheel, feeling oddly clear-headed. 22 years at Datacore, and this kid thought he could strip me of my professional respect with a rehearsed line and a smirk. The insult barely scratched the surface compared to what he'd actually done. Spencer had no idea who he'd just fired, because buried under the polo shirts and quiet competence they'd known all these years was someone who had quietly built the skeleton key to the entire operation. Every login, every secure portal, every encrypted handshake that made Datacore tick. It all passed through a system called SecureLink Pro, a system I'd founded and licensed to them years before Spencer ever heard of this company, and tucked neatly into the master. License agreement was a clause so simple it should have been impossible to miss. This license remains valid only while the named architect remains actively employed by Datacore Industries. Termination of employment results in immediate license termination. I pulled out of the lot slowly. It wasn't revenge yet. At that moment, it was just a reminder to myself that the game wasn't over. It was barely starting. Driving home, I thought about all those Saturday nights I'd spent fixing things in the shadows. Locked out executives at 2 a.m. before board presentations. Security breaches that could have tanked us. The time I spent my anniversary weekend rebuilding our authentication system after a ransomware attempt. Management never remembered those moments, but I did. By the time I got home, the anger had crystallized into something sharper. I poured coffee and opened my personal laptop. I logged into the SecureLink admin panel, my admin panel, and checked the license status. Still, active because HR paperwork hadn't fully processed yet. But when it did, that master key was going to vanish. Every single employee would find themselves staring at login screens with no way through. I closed the laptop without making a move. Timing mattered here. I needed to let them walk face first into the problem. No warning shots. Just that inevitable moment when Spencer's condescending smile dissolved into confusion, then panic. The first crack showed up by 6 p.m. My phone buzzed with a text from Hunter Wells, one of the senior engineers I'd worked with for years. Can't access the VPN, weird auth errors. You around? I could picture Hunter at his home office, frowning at his monitor, trying different passwords before reaching out to me out of habit. I didn't respond. This wasn't his problem to solve, and it sure wasn't my job anymore. Besides, this was just the first tremor. 20 minutes later, my personal phone lit up with a Slack notification. My personal number was still linked to some ancient contact record. Client portal throwing 403s everywhere. Who's got admin creds for SecureLink? This is blowing up. The sender clearly hadn't meant to reach me. I chuckled and put the phone face down. They were already panicking about client access, and the license hadn't even fully expired yet. I didn't check my phone again. The messages would keep piling up, a monument to the fact that their safety net was gone. This wasn't sabotage. It was the natural consequence of a decision they'd made with their eyes wide shut. By morning, the trickle had turned into a flood. I woke to genuine quiet for the first time in years. No 6 a.m. urgent emails, just peace. I made coffee and glanced at my phone. Even without opening messages, I could see the storm brewing in the previews. Payroll locked. VPN dead. Who reset production? And the one that made me smile. Do you still have admin access by any chance? Across town at Datacore headquarters, the real show was underway. By 8:15 a.m., every department was feeling it. Marketing couldn't open campaign dashboards. Sales was locked out of Salesforce. Engineers couldn't access code repositories. Even HR couldn't get into payroll systems. In reality, the master license for SecureLink Pro had quietly expired at 2:17 a.m., and the entire authentication layer had gone dark. No master key meant no logins, period. Critical alerts were piling up. Red banners across internal systems screaming, "Access denied." Clients calling about their own dead logins. The irony was beautiful. Less than 24 hours ago, Spencer had smugly told me to leave my dignity on his desk, not realizing he was actually firing the only person who knew how their digital infrastructure worked. By mid-morning, IT had exhausted the turn it off and back on phase and moved into dangerous territory. In a cramped conference room, Garrett Stone, the IT director, was pulling up network diagrams, tracing authentication flows. Every login attempt had one thing in common. It routed through a vendor most of them had never heard of. The name sat there in clean text, SecureLink Pro. "We don't have an account with these people, do we?" Garrett asked. Blank stares. Nobody realized they were looking at the beating heart of Datacore's security system, because to them, it was just background infrastructure. Except Maxwell Gray, the CFO. When the diagram landed in his inbox, something flickered at the edge of his memory. Years ago, he'd signed off on an authentication platform a senior hire had personally vouched for. The guy who'd just been escorted out yesterday afternoon. By the time he connected those dots, legal was on the phone with SecureLink Pro, trying to figure out why their master license was suddenly dead. The conversation was brief. The rep confirmed everything. "Your master license agreement states continued access requires active employment of the named architect. That employee is no longer active. As of 2:17 a.m., the license was automatically terminated. No wiggle room, no courtesy extension. It was like a circuit breaker had tripped, and the only person who knew where the panel was had just been fired. The call came just after lunch. I was enjoying the kind of slow afternoon I hadn't experienced in 2 decades when my phone lit up with Datacore's main line. I let it ring twice before answering. "Adrian." Spencer's voice was different, still had that sharp edge, but softer now, uncertain. "We need you to unlock the system. Not could you or would you mind?" Phrased like a demand, but the undertone was pure desperation. I let the silence stretch, then evenly. "You'll have to take that up with SecureLink Pro." A pause. I could hear voices in the background, IT scrambling, legal talking over each other. "Right," he said. "We've spoken to them. They said the license is tied to you personally." "That's correct. And since I'm no longer employed there, the license is terminated. Their system is functioning exactly as designed." Another pause. "So, what would it take to get you to reinstate it?" Less than 48 hours ago, he'd been smirking in front of HR. Now he was calling me like we were partners facing the same crisis. "I'm not in a position to discuss that right now," I said neutrally. "You have SecureLink's contact information. I suggest you work through them." Before he could respond, I hung up. That call told me everything. They were past the point of pretending this was a minor outage. They'd hit the wall and realized there was no way over it without me. By the next morning, the ripples had turned into waves crashing into the boardroom. The CEO had called an emergency meeting at 8:30 a.m. sharp. Datacore's top 5 clients were threatening to walk. The meeting started with Garrett running through the facts. Access failure was now total. Internal tools, client portals, vendor integrations, payroll, code repositories, all dead. Overnight workarounds had failed. Attempts to bypass the authentication layer had failed. Every road led back to one gate, and that gate was welded shut. Then came the gut punch. Someone finally pulled up the original SecureLink Pro license agreement. There it was, plain as daylight. This license remains valid only while the named architect, Adrian Pierce, remains actively employed by Datacore Industries. Termination of employment results in immediate license termination. No exceptions. The room went quiet. That's when Bryce Hamilton, one of the board members, turned and looked directly at Spencer. Why? He asked slowly. Did you fire the only person holding the keys to our kingdom? Spencer tried corporate speak about organizational restructuring and aligning talent with future needs. But his voice wavered. He couldn't dress this up as anything other than what it was, a catastrophic miscalculation. The CEO cut the air. Do you have a plan to fix this? Spencer stammered something about IT and making progress. Garrett cut in. With respect, no, there's no fix without Adrian. Board members exchanged glances. DataCore wasn't dealing with a system outage. They were dealing with the consequences of firing the one person who was the system. Word leaked out by midday. Within hours, the story was circulating. DataCore had lost control of its own authentication system. For enterprise clients, that phrase was like shouting "fire" in a crowded theater. Meanwhile, my personal inbox was starting to look like a negotiation table. First polite, "Perhaps we could chat." Then urgent, "We're hoping to resolve this quickly." By end of day, "Name your number, please." Less than 72 hours ago, I was being told to leave my dignity on Spencer's desk. Now, the same people were practically begging. The invitation came through Bryce Hamilton, the board member I respected. No corporate posturing, just, "Would you be willing to attend a meeting to discuss a resolution?" The tone told me everything. They weren't calling me in to negotiate. They were calling me in to surrender. The following morning, I walked into the same boardroom where Spencer had staged his power play. The atmosphere was tense, brittle. Around the table sat the CEO, CFO, half the board, and Spencer. The smirk was gone. His skin had that pale look of someone living on fluorescent lights and caffeine. I placed my folder on the polished wood and opened it calmly. Inside was a single document, my revised licensing proposal. I slid copies across the table like a dealer laying down a winning hand. The terms were straightforward. New rates, $285,000 annual retainer, payable up front, 3-year minimum contract, and in a clause that made several board members glance at each other. A written acknowledgement from Spencer of the oversight that led to the license termination. That last part wasn't for the money. It was for the principle. Maxwell picked up the document, scanning without a word. The CFO was already calculating costs. Spencer sat frozen, hands folded. It didn't take long. The CEO set the papers down, looked me dead in the eye, and said, "We'll sign." Signature stacked in neat blue ink. When Spencer signed his acknowledgement, his hand shook slightly. I didn't smile, didn't gloat. Just watched the moment he committed on paper to the most expensive lesson of his career. When the last page was signed, I gathered my folder, stood, and thanked them for their time. I walked out with the contract in hand and the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd not only won, but rewritten the rules entirely. Behind me, Spencer's career was over. Not immediately, but inevitably. A man doesn't survive a blunder this public. Outside, the morning air hit my face like a clean slate. They had their access back. I had my terms met, my leverage intact, and my professional respect exactly where it had always been. Mine to keep. And this time, they knew it. The restoration process took exactly 47 minutes once I reactivated their master license. I sat in my car in DataCore's parking lot, watching through the glass lobby as people started moving with purpose again. Phones stopped buzzing with panic. The red alert banners disappeared from monitors visible through windows. It was like watching a building come back to life after a power outage. I drove home thinking about the mathematics of respect. For 22 years, my value had been invisible. The cost of keeping things running smoothly was never calculated because smooth operation was just expected. But the cost of things not running, that had been $2.3 million per day in lost revenue, plus immeasurable damage to client relationships and company reputation. Spencer had learned an expensive lesson about the difference between managing people and managing systems. You can restructure personnel with PowerPoint presentations and org charts, but you can't reorganize fundamental infrastructure with corporate buzzwords and MBA frameworks. The $285,000 retainer was actually conservative. Other companies were already reaching out after word spread through industry networks. My phone hadn't stopped ringing with consulting inquiries. The SecureLink Pro model, tying critical vendor licenses to key personnel employment, was suddenly the hottest topic in IT risk management circles. Within a week, I had 3 other major contracts signed. Companies were scrambling to audit their own vendor dependencies, terrified they might have similar vulnerabilities. The DataCore incident had become a case study in what happens when you fire people without understanding what they actually do. Spencer lasted another 6 weeks at DataCore. Officially, he was pursuing other opportunities. Unofficially, the board had made it clear his future wasn't with the company. His replacement was a woman in her 40s who'd worked her way up through operations. Her first meeting with me was refreshingly direct. "I'm not here to fix what wasn't broken," she said. "I'm here to make sure we don't make stupid decisions about critical infrastructure again." That's when I knew DataCore might actually learn from this experience. The junior analysts who'd witnessed my firing became valuable allies. They'd learned something that day about institutional memory and the danger of dismissing experience. One told me later, "We watched them fire the guy who built everything, then panic when everything stopped working. It was like watching someone remove the foundation and act surprised when the building collapsed." The story spread beyond DataCore's walls. Industry publications picked it up. Harvard Business School added it to their case studies on technology risk management. LinkedIn was full of articles with titles like "The Hidden Costs of Firing Your IT Infrastructure" and "Why You Should Never Fire the Person Who Built Your Systems." I became something of an accidental spokesperson for the value of institutional knowledge. Conference organizers started reaching out. Podcasts wanted interviews. Everyone wanted to know about the license kill switch strategy. But I kept my responses simple and professional. No need to gloat or embellish. The facts spoke for themselves. An inexperienced manager made a hasty decision without understanding the consequences, and the market corrected itself in real time. The beautiful part was how quickly Spencer's version of events crumbled under scrutiny. He'd tried to frame the firing as part of a broader digital transformation initiative. But when the digital infrastructure collapsed immediately after my departure, that narrative became impossible to maintain. The board's confidence in Spencer evaporated along with DataCore's system access. His credibility never recovered. Word travels fast in our industry, and everyone knew what had happened. The story became a cautionary tale about the importance of understanding your technology dependencies before making personnel decisions. As for me, I was busier and more financially secure than I'd ever been. The 3-year DataCore contract provided a stable foundation, and the consulting work was both lucrative and intellectually satisfying. I was finally being compensated at market rates for expertise that had been undervalued for decades. More importantly, I was respected. When I walked into DataCore now, people listened. They valued my opinions. They understood that 22 years of keeping the lights on meant something real and measurable. The real vindication came 6 months later when DataCore announced their best quarterly results in company history. Their uptime was 99.97%, the highest it had been since I'd started working there. Client retention was up 23%. New business was flowing in because word had spread that DataCore had stabilized their infrastructure issues. The press release credited strategic investments in IT infrastructure and vendor relationship management. I had to chuckle at that. The strategic investment was paying me nearly double what they had been paying before, and the vendor relationship management was making sure they never fired the vendor again. Spencer's departure had been quiet but definitive. No farewell emails, no transition meetings. One day his nameplate was gone from his office door, and that was it. Through the industry grapevine, I heard he'd taken a position at a much smaller firm doing business development, corporate speak for someone who'd been professionally sidelined. His replacement, Patricia Wells, turned out to be everything Spencer wasn't. She had 15 years of operations experience, had worked her way up from the ground floor, and understood that technology wasn't just a cost center to be optimized. It was the foundation that everything else was built on. Her management style was refreshingly straightforward. When she had questions about system architecture, she asked. When she needed to make budget decisions affecting IT, infrastructure, she consulted the people who actually understood the technical implications. It was such a foreign concept after Spencer's reign that it took me a few weeks to adjust. The junior analysts who'd witnessed my firing became some of my strongest advocates within the company. They had learned a lesson that business schools don't teach, that organizational knowledge walks out the door with people, And sometimes that knowledge is more critical than anyone realizes until it's gone. One of them, Claire Morrison, approached me during her first-year review meeting. "I wanted to thank you for something," she said. "Watching what happened when Spencer fired you taught me more about how businesses actually work than my entire MBA program. I understand now why experience matters." Those were the moments that made the whole ordeal worthwhile. Not the money, not even the satisfaction of watching Spencer's comeuppance, but knowing that some people had learned something valuable from the experience. The consulting side of my business exploded. Within a year, I had contracts with 12 major companies, all wanting to audit their vendor dependencies and personnel risks. The data core model became shorthand in IT circles for catastrophic succession planning failures. I started giving talks at industry conferences. The most popular presentation was titled "Single Points of Failure," when your most important employee isn't on the org chart. It was always standing room only, packed with executives who were suddenly worried about their own hidden dependencies. The questions after these talks were always revealing. CEOs and CFOs would approach me privately, asking variations of the same question. How do we know if we have an Adrian Pierce in our organization? The answer was usually uncomfortable. You probably do, and you probably don't know it until they're gone. I developed a simple assessment framework that companies could use to identify critical knowledge, holders, and create proper succession plans. It became a lucrative side business, but more importantly, it helped organizations avoid the mistakes DataCore had made. The written acknowledgement Spencer had signed was never published, but it didn't need to be. The story had taken on a life of its own. Everyone in the industry knew what had happened, and the lessons were being applied across the sector. DataCore's stock price, which had dropped 8% during the crisis, recovered completely within 4 months and hit an all-time high by year-end. The board was happy. Clients were happy. Employees were happy, because they could actually do their jobs without system outages. The only person who wasn't happy was somewhere else, probably still trying to explain to potential employers why his last position had ended so abruptly. I kept DataCore's systems running flawlessly. Their security posture was stronger than ever. The 3-year contract provided stability for both sides. They got consistent, reliable infrastructure management, and I got the financial security to be selective about additional consulting work. But the best part was the respect. When I walked into meetings now, people listened. When I raised concerns about system vulnerabilities or recommended infrastructure investments, those recommendations were taken seriously. The value of institutional knowledge was no longer invisible. Looking back, I realized I could have handled things differently. I could have been petty, vindictive, or unprofessional. Instead, I'd let competence speak louder than anger. The outcome was more satisfying than any dramatic confrontation could have been. The moral of the story wasn't about revenge. It was about understanding value. For 22 years, my contributions had been taken for granted because stable systems don't call attention to themselves. It took a crisis to reveal the true cost of that stability. Spencer had thought he was making a statement about organizational efficiency. Instead, he'd created a perfect case study in the difference between cost and value. The cost of my salary was visible on budget spreadsheets. The value of my work only became apparent when it was gone. In the end, the market corrected itself. Experience was valued appropriately. Institutional knowledge was recognized and protected. And somewhere in the background, DataCore's systems hummed along quietly, doing what they were supposed to do, just the way I'd always intended. The phone calls still come in regularly. Companies that want to avoid becoming the next DataCore case study. Each one is a reminder that respect for expertise isn't just good business practice. It's essential for survival in a world where digital infrastructure is everything. Spencer had learned that lesson the hard way. The industry had learned it from watching his mistake. And I'd learned that sometimes the best response to disrespect isn't anger. It's simply demonstrating what respect is actually worth. The most dangerous employee to fire isn't the one who makes the most noise. It's the one who's been quietly holding everything together. True power in the workplace doesn't come from a title or an office. It comes from being the person others can't afford to lose.